Elias Boone walked into the bank in a work jacket with $9 in his account. In front of a lobby full of customers, branch manager Derek Sutter read that balance aloud, laughed, and asked if the single father had come to beg for change. Elias did not argue. He placed a sealed envelope on the counter and asked to see the chairman. 17 minutes later, attorneys walked through the front door. A boardroom screen lit up, and a $40 million deal appeared on the table. The man being mocked did not need a loan. He came to buy the bank. Hit subscribe right now, because $9 was only the surface of a stunning reversal that made every executive in that building pay the price. On a Monday morning in Belhaven, Ohio, Elias Boone pulled his old pickup into the parking lot of Crestmont Bank's flagship branch and found a space between two executive sedans whose monthly lease payments probably exceeded his truck's entire purchase price. He was 43 years old, wore a denim jacket and work pants carrying a faint trace of metal dust, and he moved through the glass doors with the unhurried calm of a man who had nowhere urgent to be. Nothing about his appearance suggested he was anything other than what he looked like. A local tradesman running a small repair shop on the east side of town, a widower who had raised a daughter on his own, a person the banking industry had long since classified as low value. He took a number from the dispenser near the entrance, chose a seat in the waiting area, and rested a sealed envelope on his knee without explaining it to anyone. The branch was clean, bright, and designed to make a particular kind of person feel at home, the kind with investment portfolios, commercial accounts, and weekend properties they needed to refinance. Teller windows gleamed under recessed lighting. A coffee station near the entrance offered fresh cups and printed napkins. The customers who moved through the space with ease wore pressed collars and carried briefcases, and the staff greeted them by name. Elias waited. He had been doing that in one form or another for the better part of a decade, and he had gotten very good at it. When his number was called, he walked to the counter and explained quietly that 3 fees had appeared in his checking account over the preceding 90 days. A monthly maintenance charge, an inactivity fee, and a document processing charge he had never agreed to. The account had once held a comfortable buffer, left there to cover small recurring payments. After the 3 charges ran, the balance showed $9. He said he wanted someone with authority to explain whether the fees were correct, and if they were not, to reverse them. The teller who took his request was Maren Holt, a 31-year-old with sharp eyes and 5 years of experience reading fee structures that most customers never bothered to question. She pulled up the account, ran the dates, and identified the problem within 60 seconds. 2 of the 3 fees had been applied under a revised policy that only applied to accounts opened after a specific date, and Elias's account predated that revision by nearly 4 years. She began entering a correction. She was about to tell him the matter was resolved when Derek Sutter appeared behind her. Derek was the branch manager, 38 years old, with a new watch and a habit of positioning himself wherever the most important people in the room happened to be standing. On this particular Monday, the most important people were a group of senior executives and a regional journalist who had arrived to document the launch of Crestmont's community reinvestment campaign. Victoria Langford was with them. Derek took one look at Elias's jacket, noted the transaction Maren was reversing, and made a calculation. He redirected Maren back to her station with a word about another customer and took over the interaction himself. His voice carried enough volume that the nearest visitors could hear him clearly. He pulled up the account on the screen, tilted his head, and read the balance aloud. $9, he said. Sir, the paperwork alone to process a complaint costs the bank more than what you've got in here. A few people near the coffee station looked over. Someone laughed. Derek let the pause breathe before adding, almost warmly, that if Elias was having trouble keeping the lights on, the bank had pamphlets near the door for local financial assistance programs. Elias did not raise his voice. He did not move from where he was standing. He looked at Derek for a long moment and asked, in the same quiet register he had used from the beginning, whether the way Derek was speaking to him reflected official bank policy toward customers with low balances, or whether it was Derek's personal contribution to the customer experience. Derek smiled the way people smile when they believe they hold every advantage in a situation. He said Crestmont was a premium institution that prioritized relationships with real financial value, that the bank preferred to focus its resources on clients with more to offer, and that if Elias was unhappy, he was welcome to try one of the credit unions across town. Elias checked his watch, looked back at Derek, and said his meeting with the board of directors would begin in 17 minutes. He placed the sealed envelope on the counter between them and did not take his hand off it. Victoria Langford had entered the branch 3 minutes before Elias pulled his number, accompanied by 2 regional directors, the bank's public relations coordinator, and a journalist who had agreed to cover the community banking initiative the communications team had spent 6 weeks preparing. She was 45, wore a charcoal blazer over a silk blouse, and moved through the room with the fluency of someone who had been taught from childhood that authority was something you inhabited rather than earned. The initiative she was there to announce, described in marketing materials as Crestmont's commitment to every corner of its community, had been timed deliberately to counter a wave of negative press about rising service fees. Nobody in that lobby looked more at ease in a bank than Victoria Langford, and nobody in the room worked harder to keep it that way. Derek found her near the customer appreciation display and pulled her aside to describe the situation at the counter, framing it as comic relief. A walk-in with $9 in his account was demanding to see the board chairman. He was wearing work clothes. He had left a sealed envelope on the counter like he thought he was in a film. Victoria glanced toward Elias, processed something in her expression, and decided he was harmless. The last name Boone surfaced a faint memory, a small commercial account, some kind of local repair operation, one missed payment cycle during what she recalled as a difficult personal period, nothing that required serious attention. She walked over with the easy confidence of someone making a courtesy appearance and asked if there was something she could help him with, in the measured tone of a person who had no intention of helping him with anything at all. When Elias said he was there to conduct an assessment of the bank, she let her gaze fall briefly on his jacket, then returned to his face. She asked, not unkindly, whether he had come to seek an extension on a loan. He told her he was not a loan customer. He told her he was evaluating the institution. Victoria smiled and said the words that would become the most expensive sentence she ever spoke. A man with $9 should assess his own life before he assessed her bank. The room went quieter. A regional director covered a laugh with a cough. The journalist jotted something in a notepad. Marin Holt had returned to the edge of the situation and tried to interrupt, pointing out that the fees in question had been applied incorrectly and that Elias's complaint was valid. Derek cut her off with a look that communicated she would hear about her interference later and should return to her desk immediately. Marin held her ground for exactly 2 seconds, one more than most people on that floor had ever managed, and then stepped back. Victoria told Elias that reversing the fees would set a precedent she was not willing to establish for accounts that were not generating meaningful value for the institution. If he found the terms unsatisfactory, the branch would be happy to facilitate the closure of his account that same morning. Then Elias asked her 3 questions, one after another, without waiting for a response to the first before moving to the second. He asked if she knew how many customers had been charged those same fees in the past 18 months. He asked if she knew how much the bank stood to lose from a portfolio of internally approved loans connected to the Langford family's real estate interests. He asked if she knew that the buyer of Crestmont Bank was scheduled to sign a binding agreement before the close of business that day. Victoria's composure tightened almost imperceptibly at the third question. The buyer's identity had been held under strict confidentiality. Only the board and a small legal team knew who was arriving that morning and when. She directed the branch security officer to escort Elias out before the press event began. The front door opened instead. Naomi Price walked in at the head of a four-person legal team, crossed the lobby without breaking stride, and told Elias directly that the $40 million escrow had been confirmed. 6 months before that Monday morning, Elias had been sitting in a law office 3 blocks from the Ohio State House, reviewing a quarterly pipeline with Naomi Price and 2 financial analysts. Blue Heron Bancorp was not a name that appeared in the business press, and that was entirely intentional. It was a private holding entity Elias had structured after selling the bulk of his stake in LedgerShield, the bank fraud detection software company he had founded in his mid-30s, and built into something large enough to attract a major acquisition offer. He had not planned to sell when he did. His wife's illness had changed the timeline for everything. He liquidated enough to secure his daughter's future and his own freedom to step back, and then he watched the company he had built continue without him while he learned how to be a father who was also the only parent his daughter had left. By the time Elias turned 42, he had been looking for a way to put the capital to work that matched something he actually believed in. What he believed in was the kind of banking that most large institutions had quietly abandoned: patient credit for people building something real. Institutions that existed to serve their depositors rather than extract fees from them. Community banks that were failing, he had come to understand, were failing for reasons that had very little to do with their markets and almost everything to do with how they were managed. Blue Heron's model was to identify those banks, clear out the structural dysfunction, recapitalize them properly, and return them to something close to their original purpose. Crestmont was the third bank on the acquisition list. The problems there were not hard to find once someone knew where to look. The loan book contained a cluster of commercial real estate credits extended to entities connected to a family the board had trusted for decades. The collateral on those loans had been appraised well above its realistic value. Capital ratios were deteriorating. Regulators had quietly informed the board that the institution needed either a significant infusion or a qualified buyer within a defined window. The board had opened a confidential sale process, and Blue Heron's offer had been submitted through Naomi's office under a name that revealed nothing about the principal. Elias had not attended a single negotiation meeting in person. He had reviewed every document, signed every authorization, arranged for the escrow deposit to clear, and no one on the Crestmont side had known who was behind the bid. The branch visit that Monday was not a setup. It was what Elias described as a routine check. He visited every target bank the same way, walked in without announcing himself, waited in line, asked a question, watched how the staff responded. He had discovered the fees on his own account 3 weeks earlier when the bank notified him that the balance had dropped below the minimum required to keep the account active. 2 of the charges did not match the terms of his original agreement. The visit was meant to take 20 minutes. What it became instead was an unintentional demonstration of exactly why Crestmont needed to change ownership. Every instinct Derek Sutter and Victoria Langford had put on display that morning confirmed what the spreadsheets already suggested. The institution's dysfunction was cultural as much as financial, and it ran from the top floor to the teller line. Elias collected the envelope from the counter, walked past the press setup near the front windows, and stepped into the elevator reserved for board-level visitors. The conference room on the top floor was designed to project permanence, dark paneling, a long table that could seat 20, framed photographs of every board chairman since the bank's founding more than a century earlier. Harlan Wexley sat at the head of the table with 4 other board members, outside legal counsel, and Gavin Rourke, the bank's chief financial officer, who had been asked to attend but had not been told why. The meeting had been scheduled for 9:15. At 9:12, Victoria stepped off the elevator and walked in with the authority of a person who expected to be briefed before the agenda began. She told Harlan the buyer's representative had not yet arrived. Harlan told her the representative had been in the building for the past several minutes. 2 heartbeats later, Elias came through the door behind Naomi Price. The silence that followed was specific, the kind produced when something abstract suddenly acquires a face. Harlan reached for the legal packet in front of him and checked the name on the primary ownership disclosure. Elias Boone, controlling principal, Blue Heron Bancorp. He looked up at the man in the work jacket and said nothing for a moment. Victoria's expression did not change, but something behind it recalibrated quickly. Nobody laughed. Nobody mentioned the $9 balance. Naomi set her briefcase on the table and opened it. She presented the escrow confirmation, $40 million in a third-party account, verified by 2 independent institutions, ready to transfer on execution of the purchase agreement. She presented the regulatory pre-approval letter confirming that Blue Heron had passed supervisory review and that the relevant agency had no objection to the transaction. She presented the capitalization plan outlining the additional liquidity Blue Heron would inject into Crestmont's reserve structure within 60 days of closing. Every number was verifiable. Every document carried the precision that does not come from improvisation. Victoria tried twice to interrupt with procedural objections, and was answered both times by specific clauses in the purchase agreement that had already been negotiated and approved by Harlan's outside counsel over the preceding 3 months. She then suggested what she must have known was her weakest argument, that Elias was a nominee, a front for a larger fund that was the real capital source, and that the board should demand full disclosure of every investment partner before proceeding. Elias answered that the capitalization breakdown was already in the disclosure documents Naomi had provided. The majority of the equity came from his Ledger Shield proceeds, a matter of public record. The remainder represented a small group of regional investors whose identities had been disclosed to the regulatory agency as required by law. There was no hidden source. There was only a man who had chosen not to spend the past 6 months explaining himself to people who had already decided what he was worth. He reached into the envelope he had carried into the building and placed a single page on the table, a printout of his Crestmont account history with the 3 disputed fees highlighted. He said it had come in useful. He said what he had observed in the lobby that morning confirmed what the data his team had collected showed across thousands of accounts. Low-balance customers were being systematically charged fees that either had no contractual basis or had been applied in violation of original account terms. He told the board that Blue Heron would proceed with the acquisition under one condition. The transaction would include a set of operational requirements effective from closing, an independent audit of all internal loans, a temporary suspension of Victoria's executive approvals, whistleblower protections for any employee who provided documentation of the fee practices, a mandatory restitution program for affected customers, and a full leadership review within 90 days. Victoria's voice rose for the first time. She said he was using money to settle a personal score. Elias replied that if retaliation had been the goal, withdrawing the offer and letting Crestmont absorb its own consequences would have accomplished that more efficiently. He was there because the bank's employees and account holders had not chosen the leadership that was about to cost them. The board voted to proceed with Blue Heron. Victoria Langford left the boardroom understanding 2 things. The first was that she could not stop the acquisition through the board. She had lost that vote the moment Elias walked through the door. The second was that she had roughly 3 weeks before the transaction closed, and in 3 weeks, a great deal could happen to a deal's momentum. She had built her professional reputation on narrative management in a city small enough that a single well-placed story could shift the temperature of the entire business community overnight. She began making calls that afternoon. The information that reached a regional financial journalist 2 days later was specific enough to suggest a source with detailed knowledge of the transaction. The story that appeared online the following morning asked whether the buyer of Crestmont, described only as a private holding company, had misrepresented the composition of its capital reserves, and whether the controlling principal had the financial standing his bid implied. A photograph ran alongside the text, Elias in his work jacket, standing at the counter on Monday morning. The caption described him as a local small business operator with a $9 bank balance. The story moved quickly through the local business community, and a version of it reached 3 of the 4 bidders who had previously dropped out of the sale process, 2 of whom called Harlan Wexley's office to ask whether the board should reopen the field. Within 4 days, 2 of Crestmont's largest commercial depositors had moved portions of their funds to other institutions as a precautionary measure. The bank's liquidity position, already under strain from the internal loan problems, tightened further. Harlan called Elias and said, without accusation, that the board was under pressure to request a public disclosure of his personal asset structure. Elias declined. He said he had provided everything legally required to the regulatory agency and had no intention of staging a financial performance to satisfy doubt that had been manufactured by the person most threatened by the transaction. He told Harlan that if the board had a material concern about the capitalization, it should raise it through the proper legal channel, and he would respond accordingly. Naomi, seated beside him during that call, was already drafting a communications preservation notice for Victoria's accounts. Meanwhile, Maren Holt had made a decision she had been turning over since the previous Monday. She sent a message to the email address listed in Blue Heron's regulatory filing. 3 paragraphs, factually precise. She had been at Crestmont long enough to watch a specific pattern develop over the past 2.5 years, a period that corresponded almost exactly with the introduction of a branch revenue incentive program Derek Sutter had championed with Victoria's backing. Under that program, branch managers received quarterly bonuses tied to net fee revenue per account. The consequence, which Maren suspected was not entirely unintended, was that low balance accounts had been converted from marginal customers into a fee extraction mechanism. She included documentation, a sample of account histories showing the same 3 charges appearing on accounts that predated the policy revision, a log of complaints that had been received and then removed from the queue before reaching the compliance team, and Derek's name on the access record for the complaint management system on dates matching the deletions. Elias read the message the same evening. He called Maren through Naomi's office the following morning, thanked her for her precision, and told her that her documentation would be submitted to the independent auditor as part of the operational review the board had already authorized. He made her one commitment. She would not be disciplined or dismissed for cooperating. He made her no other promises. He wanted everything she had provided to stand on its own, verified by people with no stake in the outcome. What neither of them knew was that the same evening he received her message, Gavin Rourke was sitting in the Crestmont parking structure in his car, running the numbers on a loan file a 4th time, confirming what he already knew. One of the internal real estate credits, the largest single exposure in the cluster connected to the Langford family's interests, had generated zero principal recovery and carried $12 million that existed on the balance sheet in name only. The independent audit firm Blue Heron had engaged before submitting the acquisition offer had flagged the commercial real estate loan cluster as a potential concern. What the initial review had not fully penetrated was the layering structure beneath it. 3 borrowing entities, Ohio-registered companies with minimal operating histories and assets, consisting primarily of undeveloped land held at inflated appraisal, had collectively received $63 million in credit from Crestmont over 7 years. The guarantors on those loans were connected, through intermediary holding companies, to the family of Victoria Langford's older brother, a developer who had completed exactly 1 project in the preceding decade and had spent the rest of that time moving between entities that appeared and disappeared from state corporate registries. When the deep audit team pulled the appraisal files and compared them against independent valuations of the underlying properties, the gap was not subtle. The land values used to support the loans had been marked at roughly 2.5 times what licensed appraisers assessed them to be worth. The full extent of the unrecoverable exposure came to $12 million, the amount of principal that could not be recouped through any realistic liquidation of the underlying collateral. In isolation, $12 million was a figure a healthy community bank might absorb over time. In the context of Crestmont's current capital position, already weakened by years of thin earnings and elevated operating costs, $12 million was enough to push the bank's core capital ratio below the threshold that required regulatory intervention. Victoria understood this. She had understood it for longer than she had admitted to anyone, and she saw in it the last viable pressure point she had. She presented the gap to the board not as a confession but as a discovery, evidence, she argued, that Elias and his team had known about the full scope of the impairment before submitting their offer and had deliberately understated their awareness in order to negotiate a price that forced the bank to absorb its own damage. She called it predatory. She used the word fraud. She produced no evidence for those characterizations, but she produced the number, and the number was real. And real numbers have a way of lending credibility to surrounding arguments, regardless of whether that credibility is earned. Several board members asked whether the deal should pause while the legal question was evaluated. Harlan asked Elias directly whether Blue Heron's team had full visibility into the $12 million exposure when the offer price was set. Elias said they had partial visibility into the cluster and had priced a risk buffer into their model. He said they had not had full documentation of individual loan performance until the audit began because that documentation had not been provided in the initial data room. He said the relevant question was not whether the buyer had priced a risk premium, but whether the bank's management had disclosed what they knew when they were required to disclose it. That question had no comfortable answer, and everyone in the room knew it. Elias drove home after 11 that night. His daughter was still awake, reading at the kitchen table, and she had been reading about her father, or rather, about someone who looked like her father, described in a series of articles over the past week as either a visionary operator or an opportunistic predator, depending on who was filing the story. She had known about Blue Heron in general terms, the way adult children know the outlines of a parent's professional life without knowing the particulars. She had not known the scale. She looked up when he came in and asked, without criticism, why he had not simply shown people what he was worth. Elias sat down and said that doing so would have conceded the argument that a number on a screen was a reasonable measure of a person's value, and that was an argument he was not willing to lose even if winning it would have made the past week easier. Sadie was quiet for a moment, then said their mother used to tell her that money only meant something when it protected other people's right to choose. Elias looked at the table and said he knew. He said he remembered. He decided, before he slept, to continue. He would keep the price at $40 million and require the existing shareholders to account for the gap themselves, while Blue Heron provided emergency liquidity once control transferred. Every executive whose authorization appeared on the problem loans would face a full review, and the file would go to federal investigators. He was not walking away. 8 days before the scheduled closing, Victoria presented the board with what she described as a disclosure breach. A set of internal emails that appeared to show Blue Heron's acquisition team had been made aware of the $12 million impairment through an unauthorized channel 4 months before the offer was submitted. The emails, printed and tabbed in a binder, used real Blue Heron email addresses and referenced specific loan identifiers that only appeared in Crestmont's internal systems. They described a strategy for pricing the offer low enough to leave the gap on the seller's balance sheet while avoiding the disclosure obligation that would have required Elias's team to flag it formally. If the documents were authentic, the acquisition was legally compromised and Elias could face a securities investigation. Victoria set the binder on the table with the quiet confidence of someone who believed she had just ended the conversation. Naomi's first step was to request the original file metadata, which she received within the hour. The emails had been generated on Crestmont's internal mail server. They had never passed through Blue Heron's systems. That alone was not definitive, since correspondence could theoretically have been forwarded. What broke the construction was the timestamp format. Blue Heron's document management protocol automatically converted all file timestamps to Eastern Standard Time on save or transmission. The timestamps in Victoria's binder used the central time offset that Crestmont's server applied by default, a difference of exactly 1 hour, consistent across every entry in the set. Someone had created those emails on a Crestmont machine without knowing how to mask the server's native time setting. The access logs for the period during which the files must have been generated showed Derek Sutter had requested elevated data room permissions 2.5 weeks earlier, citing a need to compile legacy customer records for a transition briefing. The access had been granted at branch manager level, 1 tier below data room clearance. The logs showed he had navigated into directories outside the scope of his stated purpose. The files he had accessed included the loan identifiers used in Victoria's binder. Derek was summoned to a meeting with Naomi and 2 members of the board's legal counsel. He said he had followed instructions. When pressed on whose instructions, he said he had been told the information was needed for an internal competitive analysis Victoria's office was preparing. He said he had not known what the files would be used for. He said he had simply copied what he was asked to copy and sent it where he was told to send it. The room let that answer settle. For the first time, Derek Sutter began to understand that the structure he had been loyal to had always planned to need someone at the bottom to absorb the weight. Victoria said nothing in response to Derek's account. She denied the characterization. She said Derek had misunderstood a request. She said the emails had come from a source she could not presently name, but whose credibility she was prepared to defend. Harlan told her that the board's outside counsel would be reviewing the authentication findings, and that she should make herself available for questions. Gavin Rourke had said almost nothing through most of that period, attending the required meetings, answering procedural questions with procedural answers, keeping his face arranged in the careful neutrality of a man who knew the ground under him was eroding and was trying not to look down. Elias asked to meet with him privately, without lawyers, without any formal agenda. They sat in a coffee shop 2 blocks from the bank on a Wednesday afternoon. Elias did not offer immunity. He did not threaten consequences. He told Gavin that the signatures already on the documents were not going to change no matter what happened next, but the next signature Gavin put on anything would define what the existing ones meant. Gavin ordered a second coffee, then told Elias where the recording was. The board convened an emergency session on a Thursday morning with every voting member present, and Victoria's personal legal counsel seated against the wall. The meeting had been called to resolve two questions: whether to void the purchase agreement with Blue Heron on the grounds of the alleged disclosure irregularity, or to remove Victoria from her executive authority before the scheduled closing. These were not technically mutually exclusive options, but in practice only one of them was going to happen, and everyone in the room understood that from the moment the door closed. Victoria opened her remarks with the $9 balance. She asked the board plainly whether they intended to transfer ownership of a banking institution with more than a century of community history to a person who could not maintain a minimum account balance. She let the question sit before saying that what Elias had done over the preceding 3 weeks demonstrated not operational competence but personal animus, that the conditions he had attached to the deal were retaliation dressed as governance, and that the board was allowing a wounded ego to masquerade as due diligence. She said the Langford family had served the bank for 2 generations, and she would not stand by while it was stripped apart by someone who had walked in off the street with work clothes and an old grudge. Elias did not respond to any of that directly. He asked the projection screen to display a list. Several thousand anonymized account numbers with corresponding transaction dates, fee types, and dollar amounts. He did not explain the list immediately. He let the board look at it. The accounts on that list belonged to people who had retired on fixed incomes and had not noticed a monthly charge until their buffers were gone. They belonged to veterans who had opened accounts at Crestmont because it had been the neighborhood bank their parents used. They belonged to small business owners whose fee loads had increased by 30% without any change to their original account agreements. They belonged to families who had missed a rent payment or a prescription because an unexpected bank charge had tipped them into the negative and triggered an overdraft fee on top. Elias said the $9 balance did not prove he was poor. It proved the bank's fee structure had been designed to extract whatever remained from people who had very little left. Naomi followed with the evidentiary summary, the escrow confirmation, the forensic finding that Victoria's email binder had been assembled on a Crestmont server, the access logs with Derek's name, and the recorded conversation Gavin had provided, in which Victoria instructed him to move a set of troubled credits off the primary ledger before the audit began and characterized the restructuring as routine portfolio management. She also presented the wire instruction for $6 million that had been prepared and was waiting for final authorization when Naomi's team requested the regulatory hold. Victoria said the recording had been taken without her consent, and its admissibility was a question for the courts. Harlan said that was probably correct, and in the meantime the board would be making its own governance decision on the basis of what it had heard. The vote was 8-1. Victoria's executive access was suspended immediately pending investigation. The board referred the matter to the relevant federal authorities before the session adjourned. The final authorization window opened at 4 o'clock that afternoon. Naomi's team had spent the preceding week working with Crestmont's outside counsel and the escrow agent to ensure that every condition precedent had been satisfied and that no single outstanding approval could be used as a delay mechanism. The regulatory hold that had been placed on large outgoing transactions during the investigation period remained active, which meant the $6 million transfer Victoria had attempted to authorize 3 days earlier was still frozen and flagged. When Gavin formally confirmed that the transfer instruction had originated from Victoria's credentials, the federal inquiry expanded to include wire fraud, and her administrative access to Crestmont's systems was revoked entirely. By the time the transfer window opened, she had no remaining authority to act on anything within the bank. At 4/17, $40 million moved from the third-party escrow account to the distribution accounts established for Crestmont's existing shareholders. Blue Heron Bancorp became the controlling owner of Crestmont Bank. The transaction that had been in preparation for 6 months and under sustained public attack for 3 weeks completed without complication in approximately 9 minutes of wire processing. Elias was in the building when it happened, sitting at a small conference table in the branch's back office with a cup of coffee and the printout of his $9 account balance, which he had folded and kept in his jacket pocket since Monday morning. He came out to the lobby when the confirmation arrived. There were no cameras. There was no announcement over the branch speakers. The staff who were working that afternoon knew the ownership had changed because they had been told in a meeting that morning, and the reactions had ranged from relief to anxiety to a cautious, watchful quiet. Derek Sutter was behind the service desk. He had been there since 8 that morning, doing his job, saying less than usual. When Elias walked past, Derek asked if he could have a minute. He said he understood what was coming. He said he wanted Elias to know that everything he had done had been in service of metrics the bank required him to hit, and that he had not invented the pressure on his own. He said he was not trying to excuse it, just to make sure it was on the record. Elias stopped. He said a manager was still accountable for how he used the tools the organization gave him. He said Derek had a choice every time he raised his voice in a public lobby, and the choice he had made on that Monday morning was the kind that had consequences. Derek was placed on administrative leave pending the internal review. The employees who had followed standard procedures without participating in the complaint deletions or the fee misapplication were retained and enrolled in a retraining program. Maren Holt received a written offer before the end of the day, a newly created position within the bank's customer advocacy function, a team that had not previously existed at Crestmont. The offer letter described the role and its responsibilities without reference to what she had done. Elias had told the human resources team that her qualifications should stand on their own. He did not want her advancement to look like the transaction it would have been if he had constructed it that way. Victoria returned that evening to collect her personal items from the executive suite. She passed through the lobby, and Elias was standing near the teller row. She stopped and asked if buying a bank was how he dealt with a bad morning. Elias said he had not spent $40 million because she had laughed at him. He said he had spent it so she would not be in a position to laugh at the next person who walked through the door with $9 and a legitimate question. The operational changes Elias implemented at Crestmont in the 90 days following the acquisition were not dramatic, and they were not designed to be. The bank did not get a new name. It did not get a renovation. It did not get a press release describing it as anything other than what it had always been in theory and had stopped being in practice: a community bank in a specific city, serving a specific set of people who needed it to function correctly. The first thing the new management team did was identify every account that had been charged under the invalidated fee policy and issue individual restitution credits. The second was to eliminate the account minimum that had been used to justify the inactivity fee. The third was to establish a small business lending fund for ventures operating in the neighborhoods the bank's original charter had been written to serve. Complaint processing was moved into a private consultation model. No customer would be asked to discuss their account situation in a public area. A written policy, posted at every window, prohibited employees from reading a customer's balance aloud in the presence of others. A formal internal disclosure channel was created so that employees who identified policy violations could report them without routing through their direct supervisors. Loans to related parties were required to appear as a standing agenda item at every quarterly board meeting. Harlan Wexley resigned his chairmanship 3 weeks after the transaction closed, citing the board's extended failure to scrutinize the internal lending practices with sufficient rigor. His resignation letter was brief and acknowledged that his confidence in the people managing the bank had substituted for the kind of examination his position required him to conduct. Gavin Rourke cooperated fully with the federal investigation, acknowledged the reports he had signed, and accepted a consent agreement with regulators that ended his career in banking. Victoria Langford and several members of the legal team connected to the fabricated documents were indicted on charges that included obstruction of a financial transaction and attempted wire fraud. The legal proceedings were expected to continue for some time. Elias did not take the largest office on the executive floor. He chose a room near the customer service area with a glass wall facing the lobby, so he could see what was happening on the floor without being conspicuous about it. He said it helped him stay oriented. Sadie came to the branch on the morning it reopened under new management, walked through the lobby with her father, looked at the teller stations and the waiting area and the new signs on the walls, and asked whether he had remembered to put more money into the old account. He opened the application on his phone and showed her. $9. He had left it exactly where it was. He told her he intended to keep it that way, not as a monument to what had happened, but as a reminder of what the number had never meant and what the bank had decided for too long that it did mean. In the weeks that followed, Crestmont introduced what its internal policy documents called the $9 commitment, a formal service standard affirming that no customer would be dismissed, redirected, or denied a respectful conversation on the basis of their account balance. Near the end of the first month, an older man in a worn coat came through the front door, hesitated near the entrance, and told the first employee he encountered that he was worried about his account because there was almost nothing left in it. A newer teller began to gesture toward the self-service terminal before Marin stepped out from the service desk, crossed the lobby, invited the man to sit down, and told him that what he had in his account had nothing to do with how much time she had for him. From a hallway near the back of the lobby, Elias heard those words through the open door of his office. He did not come out. He did not say anything. He stood where he was and allowed himself, for the length of a quiet afternoon in a bank in Belhaven, Ohio, to believe that the distance between how things were and how they ought to be was sometimes nothing more than the space between Hertz's willingness to speak and another's willingness to listen. He did not buy that bank to prove he was wealthy. He bought it to prove they had been wrong about what wealth was for.